We'll have the display on in just a moment, but I'm going to begin tonight. We're going to be in Exodus 21. Tonight we are going to be in Exodus 21. I've really liked Exodus because there's a lot of story in Exodus. There's a lot of things that are happening. There's the Moses and being born, being put into a basket, and being sent down the river, being adopted into the Egyptian royal family, him growing up, him leaving, and growing up in the wilderness, coming back and asking Pharaoh to let his people go. You get the plagues. You have crossing the Red Sea, the children of Israel leaving. You've got battles. God providing water, God providing food, God providing law, 10 Commandments. Then you get to chapter 21. And it's here. We go verse by verse here at Calvary Chapel, so we're going to go through it. It's not nearly as much fun, but I think it's going to be useful. And for those who are Christians, now some of you may have been in the apologetics class, I think this is going to be helpful because there are some people who will criticize Christianity by saying, well, we think that slavery was okay. And actually, there are some Christians who do believe that. They're wrong, but they believe it. And what do you say to somebody who asks you about that generally, or what do you say if somebody asks you that specifically and maybe pulling something out of Exodus 21? So we're going to look at some of those verses, but before we do, we're going to look at something I talked about last time. So if you were here, it's a review. And if you weren't, well, this is something new. Exodus 21:16. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Now, we think of kidnapping usually as abducting somebody in order to get a ransom. But you can actually, kidnapping is also abducting somebody to abduct them for some other purpose, like selling them as a slave. And this verse specifically prohibits that from happening. The system of African slavery in Europe and also in the United States was based on people who were kidnapped. So for those Christians who attempt to defend slavery, there are other reasons they can be wrong, but reason number one is you've got a system that's based on something that God prohibited. Think about it this way. I buy an electric guitar. I play the guitar a little bit. Let's say I buy a Gibson Les Paul from somebody who I don't really know. He seems kind of sketchy, but you know, the price is good, the guitar looks good. I buy it. A little time goes by, I get a phone call from my local police department asking me about the guitar I purchased, or maybe they come to my home and they ask me, or maybe they ask me to come in and bring the guitar with me. I find out that it was stolen. Now, maybe I didn't know anything about that, because if I did, I would be receiving stolen property, which is a crime. Well, if I didn't know, I wouldn't be prosecuted, but you know what? I wouldn't keep the guitar either. And in the United States in the 1700s and also the 1800s, they kept the guitar. You know, they didn't ask questions as to where the slaves came from, though most knew how they were being sourced. Or they might say, well, they were abducted by other Africans or Arabs, or, you know, they weren't abducted by us. It doesn't matter. They were abducted by somebody, and that was prohibited. And we actually have a different name for that these days. We call it human trafficking. That's what it is. Human trafficking. That's how the Bible prohibits it. And slavery in Israel was actually a form of I'm not going to call it bankruptcy, but most people who were slaves in Israel went bankrupt. They didn't have, and they didn't have bankruptcy like we have it today. What happened was all the person's goods were sold off, and everybody in the family was sold off, and they became slaves. And so you had the slaves who were Jews and citizens of Israel, just like the owners were, and I'm going to expand on that a little bit later because it is going to matter as we go through some of these seemingly random and sometimes oddly specific laws and try to make sense of them. And because it's in the Bible, we should be going through it. And at Calvary Chapel, that's what we do. We do verse by verse. So if me or Paul Jr. or any of the pastors comes across a section that they don't like or they think is boring, we don't skip it. We go through it. And hopefully we'll be able to find some value tonight. I think we will. Exodus 21, 18 to 19. If men contend with each other and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and it does not die but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks outside with his staff, then he who struck him will be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. Continuing to verses 20 and 21. If a man beats his male or female, oh, no, I'm sorry. Those are not connected. This is just here. Okay. It doesn't talk about who started the fight. It only talks about who lost the fight. This law was given to a society of people who were at that time, they were migrants, they were homeless. And when they did live anywhere for any length of time, they lived in tents. There was no police. There was no professional judiciary. There were just wise men who were asked to be judges, but they weren't specially trained. There were no prisons, there were no jails. So how do you handle situations when people are getting into a fight? There's no way to investigate professionally. So what's decided here is if there's a fight and one person injures the other, the one who did the injuring is going to have to pay compensation to the one who got injured. And it doesn't matter who started the fight. Now, maybe somebody's starting a fight with me and I can't avoid it, so I'll have to defend myself. And yeah, it could end up that the other person ends up getting hurt and I end up, that might be, I think that's maybe better than being injured, and it's not like I have a choice. I could either defend myself or get punched. But in all other situations, we should be de-escalating these, because if somebody gets hurt, the other person's going to have to pay. And I think that that did serve to reduce the number of fights that you had between men who like to fight. 21:20 to 21. And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. The first read-through, this looks kind of like a problem, doesn't it? Because the first read-through, it's like, okay, if you can beat your servant with a rod or a stick or something, if they die, you're going to be punished. But if they're okay in a day or two, you're not going to get punished. Let's look at it a little closer. The top is the New King James. This is verse 21. There's the Christian Standard Bible. It says, however, if the slave can stand up after a day or two, the owner should not be punished, for he is the owner's property. Next one, New International Version, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Remember when I said it's that both the slave and the master know the rules? That's important. Let me contrast that just for a moment with the American system of slavery. Slaves in the United States were not educated. They were kept illiterate, and eventually that was done so by law. It was illegal to educate slaves. They wanted to keep them as ignorant as possible. As a matter of fact, at the end of the Civil War, after the slaves were freed, there was a day. It was, I don't remember if it was June 16th, 17th, 18th, one of those days. It's a holiday among the African American community, and it's also in some states. It's called Juneteenth. Juneteenth is not when the last of the slaves were freed. Juneteenth is when the last of the slaves found out that they had already been freed. Somebody had to come down to Texas and to let them know that you guys are not slaves anymore, you could leave if you want. Because nobody told them. Why? They wanted to get as much work out of them as possible before they realized they were freed. We don't have that situation here. We have slaves who are Jews and who know the law, masters who are Jews and who know the law. Let's say I'm a slave and my master beats me up. Whether I did something to instigate it or not, it happened. Maybe I'm not going to get up after day one. Maybe I'm not going to get up after day two. Maybe I'm not going to get up after day three. Maybe I'm going to let it go so that it has to come before the elders. I looked at some of the scholarship for these kinds of verses is they give you sort of the worst case situation and the best case, and then in between you go to the elders to try to figure out what needs to be done. If I get injured, maybe I'm going to be doing that. And maybe I'll get compensated, maybe I'll get freed, maybe I'll get freed and compensated. Maybe if I'm the master, I'm going to think twice before taking a swing at my slave. It's an imperfect solution, but in a society where you don't have police, you don't have a judiciary, where you don't have some of the things that we take for granted now, it's important. Before I go into the next section here, I want to tell you about a rock concert I attended. 2015. It was the Jay Giles Band, and this was when they were more of a rock band. They hadn't turned into the pop band that they became in the 80s, so some people will say this is when they were really good. And they also had Nils Lofgren, I think. Nils, probably. He became part of Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band. He's the little guy who played the guitar, but not the one with the bandana. Okay. And a local band called Duke and the Drivers, and they opened, and Duke couldn't make it that evening, but the rest of the band was there. And it was a great concert, but during the concert, behind me, a fight broke out. I had never seen a fight between adults before. And one of them grabbed the other one's nose, and they were taking swings at each other, and it was a little exciting, but it was kind of scary, in part because I thought it might spill over towards me, and I didn't have a lot of room to move. So it's possible I could have been collateral damage here. That's what I thought of when I read this. Exodus 21, 22 to 25. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. There's a few things in this section of Scripture. One is that it's life for life, and you get eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Let's remember again, there's no prisons. You can't send somebody to jail. There are not a lot of options for retribution here in a relatively simple society. And also, isn't this oddly specific? If men fight and hurt a woman who's pregnant so she gives birth prematurely. Huh? Well, everybody's wearing robes. All the women are in robes. How do you know how do you know who's pregnant and who isn't pregnant? Can you really tell? Maybe if it's somebody in my clan, maybe I might be able to take a guess, but even then, if the woman in question didn't want to say anything about it yet, maybe she is pregnant and I don't know. Or if I'm getting into a beef with a guy among people I don't know because people are moving around, they're migrating, or they're in these sort of temporary tent cities, there are people all around us. I don't know who's pregnant or not. I can't look at the women. We're not going to, hey, we're going to have a fight. Could you just let me know, are you pregnant? Yeah. We're not going to do that. What are we going to do? Well, if we're going to get into a fight, we're going to take it outside. If the group is moving, we're going to go off to the side and do our thing. And if we're camped somewhere, we're going to go outside the camp and we're going to have our fight. And maybe if one guy gets injured, we're going to go back and refer to that law we went through a little bit earlier. But this was a way that you could cause men who might be getting into a fight to take a moment and to make better decisions about where and when to do it. Exodus 21, 26 to 27. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. I was like maybe 12 when I first saw that. Because I grew up in evangelical churches, so I've been around church most of my life. And when I read that, I was like, well, how's an eye worth a tooth? That doesn't make any sense. We got 2 eyes. They're very important. We got how many teeth? 36? Did I get that right? Okay. It didn't make sense to me. But I didn't really think about it very much until I had to think about it now, because I'm talking to you this evening. Let's say I'm a slave again. And I get hit. If I get hit in the eye, that's a no-brainer. Everyone's going to see, and I'm going to be free. What about the tooth? Well, you know what they didn't have back then? Dental care. People lost teeth all the time. Matter of fact, maybe if I've got a loose tooth, I'm kind of working it and working it and working it. It's not out yet, but it's almost out. What's to prevent me from saying or doing something? Because I know how my master is, and I know what makes him mad, so I'm going to make him mad, and he'll take a swing at me, and I'll make sure I fall, and out pops the tooth. And that tooth is my get out of slavery free card. Okay? It's one more way that masters are being encouraged to treat their slaves well. And in that society, it served its purpose. It is not an ideal situation, but for the people that you had at that time and what they were doing and where they were going and what was available, it worked. Exodus 21, 28 to 29. As we're reading along here, whenever you see the word ox, think vicious dog. Okay? All right. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. I didn't mean that part. Okay. But the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. But if the ox tended to thrust its horn in the past at times, and it had been made known to the owner, and he had not kept it confined so that it killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. Just simple responsibility, and the analogy that we have today that will help us understand that is people who keep vicious dogs. Not only do they keep dog, it's not the dog's fault. It's the owner's fault. They're not trained at a young age. They're not controlled. And if the dogs are known to be vicious and they're not controlled and they and they hurt somebody, those people can be prosecuted. That's negligent homicide. And here, the owner would lose their life. Well, let's press on further. Maybe that won't happen. Verse 30, if there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed on him, whether it is gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment it shall be done to him. If the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So we do have a way that the owner can live, but it's going to cost them. And probably at this time, if somebody owned an ox, they were pretty well off. They had money. Well, they had money because they're not going to have it anymore, because they're going to have to pay what they have in order to stay alive. And that is the penalty for not controlling their animals. That is personal responsibility. And again, a way to enforce personal responsibility when you don't have police and you don't have judges. You don't have a lot of things that we have today. And I forgot to change the titles here, so we're in Exodus, but it keeps saying 30 to 32. It's not. We're going 33 and 34. If a man opens a pit and another man, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, then an ox or donkey falls in it. The owner of the pit shall make good, and he shall give money to their owner, but the dead animal shall be his. Well, there are different reasons you could dig a pit, and they had practice. You might dig a pit for temporary storage. Okay. But whoever did that had a responsibility to make sure that they covered it in such a way that somebody's not going to fall into it. And apparently this is the thing, that people didn't always cover it, and so a person or an animal could fall into it. The animal could be injured or even die. And what happens here is that if I dig a pit and Pastor Joe has his ox and the ox falls in it, I just bought an ox from Pastor Joe. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide money from it, and the dead ox they shall divide. We'll stop there for a moment. So if I have an ox that I've never hurt, like Pastor Joe's ox again, it's never hurt anybody. It's a sweet animal, and I've got my ox, but for some reason the ox, they don't like each other, and my ox gets killed. So we're going to sell both of them, and we're going to get the proceeds, and we're going to split it. And that's not the ideal situation, but it is fair. But in 36, it says, or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in times past, and the owner had not kept it confined, then he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. Now let's pretend my ox is the unruly one. Pastor Joe's ox is a sweetheart. My ox kills his ox. We switch. He gets the live ox and hopefully does a better job of keeping it under control. And I get the dead ox, which it's not like I'm getting nothing. You get the meat from the ox, you get the hide from the ox, but not as valuable as a live ox. It's a way to resolve this situation, what could be a common situation, in a way that's going to work in this kind of society. And it also stresses the importance of personal responsibility. And that's it. These laws are kind of random, kind of odd, but we may get, as Christians, questioned about them, particularly the ones that have to do with slavery. And we should understand, have some familiarity with the laws, be familiar with how slavery was practiced in Israel, that it was really more of a form of bankruptcy, if you will, that slavery only lasted 7 years, maximum, as opposed to other kinds of slavery, like the American slavery that I already talked about, or even Roman slavery, which happened when Rome would conquer a people. They would basically loot that area, take whatever they could, take the people, sell them as slaves. That's what the Romans did, and that's how their slavery was based. It's good to know that information in case you're asked. So, fortunately, as disciples of Christ, we're called to something different. We're called to love each other, to avoid conflict, to be responsible, to own up to things if there's something that, if I do something that's wrong, I need to own up to it and try to make it good as best I can. And then the other person is to forgive. And maybe it doesn't make things perfect, but in time it'll be okay, if we want it to be, if we both are following Christ. And one of my prayers is, because this dovetails ever so slightly with apologetics, that when we have discussions with people, that we're being gentle with them. Because the important thing isn't to win an argument, it's to win somebody over to Christ. And when we're looking at Old Testament things, we should have that in the back of our mind. It's like, what if somebody asks me about this? What would I say about it? And if you do that, I think it'll help you as you're reading through some of these things. Sometimes it won't matter. Later on we'll get to things that have to do with mold. It's a law that doesn't apply anymore. But for some of these that involve how people are relating to each other, what happens during conflict, what do you do after it, it is important. So let's pray. Lord, we're thankful for your words. Sometimes it's hard to understand, but it's perfect, and it served the people of that time well, and it still provides lessons for us that we can learn. Pray that we would understand it well enough, not only to benefit ourselves, but also to answer about it if we're asked by somebody else. And we ask that in Jesus' name.